Hi, this is Michelle Cobb. I'm Executive Director of the Podcast Academy, and we are here today with one of our educational programs. I've got Jacquie Jordan, who is a 2-time Emmy-nominated TV producer, a 3-time author, and a New York Times best-selling publisher. Wow. She now hosts her own show, Front and Center with Jacquie Jordan, and that's a broadcast podcast that aired on KTLA 5 Los Angeles and Fox 5 San Diego. She's also the founder of the 15-year-old TV Guestpert. Boy, that's tough to say. And she is also, if you didn't know this, the cousin of a name you might know in podcasting, Joe Rogan. So lots of stuff going on there. Jacquie, I'm going to turn things over to you and remind anyone in the audience, if you have questions, just put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them later. All right, Jacquie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me here, everybody at Podcast University. Really excited. I'm actually going to be talking about a conversation about podcasting, an angle that I'm really excited about, that I really look forward to sharing. And yes, Joe Rogan and I are, to me, the king of podcasters, are cousins. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, is the brother of my paternal grandmother. So brother and sister, or grandparents is really what that is. So there you go. So what we're going to talk about is what makes your podcast unique. And I'm really big into guests. Having great guests and really great storytelling. So what makes a podcast unique is what we're going to be talking about. And I look forward to your questions. Please feel free to put them into the chat. A little bit about myself. Michelle was extraordinarily generous. Yes, I'm a television producer, a 2-time Emmy-nominated television producer. I've done talk shows from Geraldo, Montel, Maury Povich, Who's Your Daddy, to many, many television pilots, one with Bob Saget. I ran an industry talk show with Peter Guber. My guest was Steven Spielberg. That was super cool. And have many stories to tell, which is why we have our podcast, Front and Center, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But back to the beginning, if you have a podcast already, hopefully that I will give you something to put some new energy or a new way of looking at your podcast. And if you're starting to think about podcasting, hopefully that I will provide you some structure to consider in order to get going. So back to the beginning, we're going to talk about the breakdown of a show, preparation, not perfection, which I think is the number one reason podcasters actually don't start podcasting, is they're too worried about the perfection part of it. And then the focus on performance we'll get to towards the end. So why start a podcast? I think there are a lot of really great reasons. I'm a big believer, as the founder of TV Guestpert, that it is a really great way to amplify your message. It is also a fantastic way to build a network, both for people who are watching your show, but also the guests that you have on, which is really critical to giving them a really great guest experience within the container of the podcast that you are putting out there. Also, one of the other benefits for it is a micro-contenting to your audience. So no matter how niche your industry is, you can find an audience and build on that by using a podcast. And I think the recent statistics say that only like 25% or 27% of podcasting right now is actually the audience have taken to it, which means that there's a lot of growth opportunity within the world of podcasting. Challenges, of course, are there are lots of ideas and not knowing which one to start with or do next. And then, of course, the differentiating yourself in a crowd of a market. And then, of course, how to get listeners to create engaging content. So we'll address some of those along the way. But Front and Center is going along with the line that I just shared. Front and Center is our podcast. We do a broadcast podcast. So we architecturally, we tape it for television and we cut the content down to podcast capacity, and then we cut it down to micro capacity for social media sharing. We do ours broadcasted out of the iHeart radio studio in Burbank, California. And the reason we decided to start a podcast for the exact reason is I found that there were these really great micro content stories about behind the scenes in the industry, like indirectly, peripherally related. And I wanted to share those people who make a really big impact that we don't necessarily know about, who have their hands on things, which is great for somebody like myself, who's a television producer or a background person, helping people come forward. So our focus is less on the technical and more on creating engaging content. I find that if we have creative, engaging content, then we can be forgiving around the technical aspects of production, which keep a lot of people hostage to wanting to do this like perfect mega production. I think if the story is there and the content is good, we can be a little forgiving about the technology and the audience will find you. So types of podcasts, just styles, something to consider, or maybe you're already doing this. But there's the interview style, which is usually the typical podcast style where you interview a guest. Then, of course, there's a narrative where NPR is really good at doing this, where they do a narrative around a story that they're portraying, which is really well done. There's a magazine, which is kind of like a narrative story, but it's you can also be cut with clips. Then there's documentary style podcasting, and then there's of course nonfiction, which is the genre that we are all dealing with at this time. So what is your idea for a podcast? What type topics or themes do you want to cover? What message do you want listeners to leave with? And if you have many ideas, which one inspires you the most? Which one gets you the most excited? So for what topics or themes do you want to cover, I think is really important, because that to me is the genesis of the guest building, the guest mining part of podcasting. And then what message do you want listeners to leave with? That can be for your overall show. That should probably be part of your mission statement, but it also should be per show. What is the message that you want to leave listeners with? We just did a show with Avery Mann, who is the founder of SOS. And I knew him from my talk show days at the Geraldo Rivera show, because he was the publicist for John Walsh, and he also worked at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So one of my beats as a talk show producer was really to cover missing children's stories. So I did a recent interview with him, which was a compelling guest. Here we are like 20 years later in our career. He's got his own company about educating parents and protecting them from child kidnapping and abduction. But what the answer to the question of what message did I want to leave listeners with is I wanted to leave listeners with how prevalent child abduction, child trafficking actually is, and what precautions people needed to be aware of. And that was what I wanted to leave listeners, and how it fit into my overall topic of front and center was that Avery and I both have been working behind the scenes in television for a long time. And he particularly had devoted an entire career and on this topic through the medium, of course, of television. So that was what I wanted to leave listeners with by inviting Avery Mann on as a guest for the show. So there we go. Let's see here. Okay, so the 4 steps to a successful podcast interview. Secret number 1. Okay, we just did that. Development, the 4 steps here. The development. So these are the 4 steps to, this is what I call the architecture for putting together a show. There's the development, which we just started talking about, the taking the ideas from concept to fully defined. Then, of course, is the pre-production, which is the task list that we need to do to put in place to create an optimal recording. Some of us will just do audio podcast recordings, and others of us are doing video, audio podcast recordings. And then, of course, the production, which is the actual event. This is a production we're doing right here, right now for Podcast University. And then, of course, the post-production, which is refine the show, make it come to life. So that's where we go with that. So learn the breakdown of a show. Let me flick forward. There we go. Here we go. Development. one of my one of my favorite parts of show is the development of the show. So the components of developing a show, of course, is the introduction of the show, the introduction of the guest, the actual interview or the content, and whether or not you have ads, and then the exit, the grace of an exit. Making a really great exit on a show, I think, is really, really good. And you want it to be flattering towards your guest. So to develop your show idea, once you have your show idea, I like to brainstorm many topic areas, which whether it be these stories of movies, clips, guests, topics that relate to your episode, and then build your guest list around the content. So what I see a lot of podcasters do is they see someone that they want to have an interview with, they want to talk to on a podcast, and they're like, hey, you'd be a really great guest on this podcast. And that becomes the genesis of why they invite to have the guest on the show. But what they usually miss in that form of thinking about producing a podcast is, well, what's the show? So this way of putting the show first and then filling it out with the best guests is allowing the guests to carry the content of the show. Instead of having a show around a guest, sometimes doesn't have any really engaging content for a listener to come to. I liken it to listening to somebody's phone conversation. It's not really fun. And with video, like to watch someone on a phone conversation, have a really intimate conversation with someone fun that they think is fun, isn't necessarily engaging or inviting to the third party. So picking your guests, think about the people you want to meet and interview, of course, in your podcast living room. So here we go. Preparation, not perfection, is secret number 3. Here we go. Okay, pre-production. Decide where you are going to set up your show, whether it's a garage, a home studio, office, a rental. Rent a studio space in a recording studio, which is also one way to do it with an in-house engineer, is about $100 to $200 an hour. There's also simpler ways to do it. And Zoom, of course, has made podcasting super, super easy and very affordable. And if you do it for less than 40 minutes and a podcast says sit down, it's still free. So when booking guests, consider logistics, communication, and then the pre-interview. I'm a big, big fan of the pre-interview, and I'm going to show you why. So guest logistics. Is it a physical interview in person, which is what we often do on Front and Center, not currently, but we often do in-person physical interviews, which is a whole type of logistical coordination? Or is it going to be Zoom or Skype, which is a communicating of time and technology? Or is it going to be over the phone, which is also a great way to record an audio interview? And obviously will be the travel to guests, which would be the physical interview. Be sure to send clear instructions and tell all tech before production. So the way we communicate, and this is how my company TV Guestbert communicates with our guests, because we book guests on all sorts of media, hopefully maybe your podcast at some point, across the country, across the world. So we communicate very specifically. We do confirmation emails that would include, or inquiries. It's an inquiry when we're asking, it's a confirmation when we're locking. So in an inquiry, we will include the date, the time, and the time zone, which is very, very a big deal in this day and age, especially if we're telecasting our coordinations. Parking information, of course, if it's a live in-person interview, which is very important for people like us when we're in California. Parking is a very, very important information. And it's not something you want a guest to figure out on the fly. Dial-in information if it's on the phone, tech information, guest speaking points and questions. So I'm a big believer in receiving speaking points from a guest, not sample questions. And you're going to find out why in a moment. But to answer this here about communicating with guests, we also put the airing information. Where does the show air? How does it air? So here in our little booking confirmation, we've got Dr. Jeanette Biaffi. She's our guestbert, and we're booking her on Fox 5, more Las Vegas, the television show. But of course, it could be your podcast. We put the show producer in and what the topic is, the when, and then will it be Skype ready for control room? And then there's going to be tape time, the length of the tape, There's a disclaimer. Sometimes that breaking news will cancel a guest last minute. Then we put the Skype information as follows and what we're asking the guest. So that is because what you want is your guest who is already so busy to only have to find all their information in one email and not have to piecemeal conversations and strings of emails together in order for them to figure out what the data is of what they're committing to put on a calendar. We don't want to do that to our guests. You want a really great guest, you give them all the information. So here's the pre-interview, which I think is so critical. And many people don't take the time to do this. So I like to conduct a pre-interview at least 1 to 2 weeks before the recording date. And I like to focus on the storytelling. So I do my research before the call, but what I do on the call is I listen carefully. And what I'm looking for is more engaging topic. There's the stuff that I can find out about a guest from the back of their book cover or their Wikipedia page or videos on them. But everybody else can find that too. So that's not making my podcast or my interview any more interesting than what's already out there. So when I have received the speaking points by initiating a booking inquiry. I've asked them to give me speaking points on this topic. So I go through the speaking points and I'm not looking to have a real interview. I'm just really looking to mine. What are the stories? Mine what makes them special? Mine what value I'm going to be offering my audience about this topic provided by this guest that's going to make it unique and interesting. So I focus on the storytelling and I get the best out of the guest. And I don't necessarily say to the guest, this is what we're going to talk about, or this is what we're going to talk about. I just make my notes because that's my job as the host. Good TV producers always do a pre-interview. My TV guest experts know this in all cases. But if we're doing our own podcast, I think this is a worthy, hey, get on the phone, hear them, hear their style, hear their cadence, just do a real good listen. Because the best stuff for your interview is going to come from your pre-interview. And one note I'm going to say on that, in talk shows, I've produced a lot of talk shows, obviously, in my career, we would put the guests in the green room prior to the show, and we wouldn't let the guests talk about the topic of the show to anybody, makeup artists, other guests in the room. Like, why are you on the show? Oh, I'm on the show because I'm here to talk about, we don't let them do that. We tell them not to, because the expression for us producers was we didn't want a good show to happen in the green room without an audience, because a guest will not repeat a good show. And so when you're doing the art of doing a pre-interview is not to get the show to happen there, because the guest will most likely not repeat the same information. You have to prompt them, but it's to get an idea of where their real good strengths are, or what are the nuggets that you're going to be able to pull out during the show. So that's the trick to a pre-interview there. Leaving a digital imprint. So preparation is key because you are leaving a digital imprint in this 2020 age that is impossible to control or erase. So we do say be prepared and not perfect. Again, that's why that pre-interview is giving you as a host, but especially giving the guest the best shot of being a really great guest on your podcast. So a couple tips, practice on the microphone to desensitize yourself to the sound of your own voice. How many of us like our own voices? We hear it, we're like, whoa, very, very strange feeling. Also, if we're working on our computer cameras, we have to note eye line as we're right here. And even as I look at my notes and my PowerPoint that I'm sharing with you, I'm doing my best to stay focused on the camera lens, because even though it's completely mechanical and you're not in front of me, I'm doing my best to stay consistently engaged with you while you're here, because that's my offering and appreciation of your time to be here. So broadcast podcasts for us as a company, the way we do our podcast show, we hire professional hair and makeup, and we understand what shot markers are, where eye lines are, where the camera is going to be, because we don't necessarily always do off the camera. And I mean, I'm kind of going a little fast, so feel free to ask me in the chat if you hear something here that you'd like me to elaborate on. I'm kind of giving you a big broad stroke here, getting into the guest part of our conversation. Focus on the performance, production and post-production. That's my team from front and center, my co-host Philip Andrew Barb, and then the back of the head of Stephanie Kobe in there. And we're actually going through the speaking points. I'm actually briefing them the same way I would brief a guest. I'm like, okay, Phil, this guest is going to say this, and you have experience with this, so I would love for you to prompt this. Kind of just giving us a little bit of directional cues there. And here's one tip, just they call me a nonfiction television producer, unscripted television is the genre. There's nothing I've ever done on television that's been unscripted, and nor should it be for your podcast, at least written in really good notes. Tips for optimal performance: know your equipment and familiarize yourself with it. In fact, I had the privilege of doing a rehearsal last week with Michelle here, and we troubleshot about 4 things that I needed to amend before I came here for this performance. So I appreciate that. Introduce your guest and topic smoothly. That is so important for me, and I will admit I am actually the worst at it. Some reason I am like so clumsy when it comes to introducing people, but there is nothing more sacred and revering to the guests that you have just asked to spend time on your show than to get their name and a proper introduction done. And I will even say, I think it's sloppy hosting and lazy hosting, sloppy hosting. And I've done it myself. When I introduce someone on my show and I say, hey, so tell us about yourself. That's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to set them up for the best success and the best shine and share with our audience. We also want to make an invitation to our listening audience or viewing audience why they want to stay engaged in listening to the actual show. They want to stay engaged because now you've introduced a really great guest that they're not going to want to turn the channel or flip their thumb on their Instagram account and get distracted doing something else. So this is why you really want to have a very strong intro. And I said, practice, 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 get the name right, get the book that they're promoting, give them the best compliment up front. I sometimes morosely say it's like giving somebody their obituary lead. Mine was like Jacquie Jordan, 2 times Emmy nominated television producer and New York Times bestselling author. It's like something like that, but it's worth it to give it. So with your guest for optimal performance, focus on storytelling. And then pay attention to timing. Timing is significantly important, and that is a host art. So part of your pre-interview, what you'll listen to is like, is this guest a quick storyteller, or are they kind of short and brief? And that will help you also understand how you need to drive the show. So paying attention to timing. Oh, you want to ask something?
Yeah, someone asked, and I think this is a good place to jump in with that. What's a good lead-off question for that pre-interview with that potential guest, since we're talking about the pre-interviews there?
Yeah, so so if we're going to do a topic like, if we're going to do a topic, I'll just use Avery Mann since I brought him up. So we talk about child trafficking. I hadn't really spoken. I followed his work, but I hadn't spoken to him physically probably in 15 years. And I followed his work and I read his stuff. But what I needed to get a sense from is also how child trafficking had changed since he was at on a collective level, from the time he was at the National Association of Center for Missing Children to starting his own business. Had it become more, people become more aware of it? Had the police become more aware of it? So I kind of needed to get a temperature on a lot of things that I wasn't educated and nor would I be, but I needed to make sure that as a host, I was going to bridge the gap. So when I spoke with Avery on the phone, I asked him, because his current company works closely with police, so I asked him what had changed within policing, whether it was FBI or local police services, towards trafficking, and he was able to confirm my hunch was that the education process within the police divisions towards trafficking and what to look for had the consciousness around that had highly accelerated since we had worked way back 15 years ago. So I hope that answered the question. So I was kind of looking for some of the gaps, because also you want to get, as a great host, what you want from the guest is you don't want to work your content out on your show. You want to work your content out during the pre-interview and then perform a great show. You want to give the greatest storytelling, nuts and bolts and juice during the show, but you don't want to work out the kinks of little things that you could have simply asked and then contextualize. So much of hosting is contextualizing a question. Avery, when you were back at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the FBI task force were quite different than they operate now today, is the way to contextualize a question. So I hope that answered that. So knowing your equipment, practice, practice, practice. For me, I'm like a techno. I'm like slow on the techno. I'm a late start, a late adopter. So I like simplicity. Like I just keep it simple for me. Keep it simple for me. But introducing your guest and your topic doesn't need to be complicated. So write out your introductions and your exits. A lot of people will also, I find this a little lazy. So they'll say, Avery, so Avery, tell us what your website is, and then often a guest will stumble. It's www.sos360.com. Like you want to be able to give them the end compliments. So practice, I have to practice ahead of time. You should meet me with my staff. I'm like running the names by them because some reason that's just, it's very clunky for me, but I also know the significance and the importance of the mastery around that. So focus on storytelling, pull stories from the pre-interview and prompt the guests to tell their own stories. You can say things like, when we spoke earlier, I learned, can you share? It's a great way to prompt them, but don't tell the stories for them. And I have to do, when I do media training from our guest for clients, I have to teach them this, is to not allow a host to steal your story. And a lot of hosts will do that because they feel, for a lot of reasons, it's not nefarious, it's usually unintentional, or they know it's a great story and they're just telling it. But you don't want to allow a host to tell your story, but you want to set your guest up for a great storytelling. Personal and relevant stories often produce engaging and relatable content. I'm a big believer. So I will ask my guests, give me a couple anecdotes. We work with, like, one of our guests right now is a medical doctor, and she does biopsies, fine needle aspiration biopsies. Okay, that's already so complicated. But she can diagnose thyroid cancer, breast cancer, like in the moment from after a biopsy. You don't have to wait for it. And so she's got a really unique specialty. But she is such a doctor and so clinical in her storytelling that that when I'm prepping her for her appearances as a guest, I often have to remind her, remember, you're a mother and a humanitarian. So tell us stories that are humanitarian about your work in medicine, not just the medicine. So that is my way of working with her to get her to tell engaging and relatable content. Because when she gets going in medicine, she's like up here and I'm like, I don't even know what she's talking about. I know she's smart, but I don't know what she's talking about. But if she can make it personal and relatable, and that's part of what we're doing as producer hosts for our podcasts. Paying attention to timing. Timing is very, very different, whether it's a 3-minute interview or a 7-minute interview. It may not feel like it is. As I got to tell Michelle last week during our rehearsal, was that I started as a radio broadcaster first, and here I was with names. The tennis player Ivan Isevich was a tennis player. I could not get his name out of my mouth. I was like, Ivan Ivanovic. But the one thing I also learned in doing radio was that, you'd find a certain song and, for 5 minutes, that would play for 5 minutes. And I knew that was my bathroom break. So time can be 30 seconds can be an infinite time. And, when you're waiting for a conference call to start in these remote working days and nobody's on, 3 minutes can feel like an eternity. So really having an internal idea of what time is. And it's important as you pace the content of the guest for your show. And that's why timing is really important. So when listening to other podcasts, note how long the interview lasts and how long the segment lasts. But as hosts, part of the timing, as we're relating it to the getting out the uniqueness of our guest, is that we want to know what the story arc is, what we want to get out. If we've got 6 minutes, where do we want to be? Like, how do we want to get into it? How do we want to peak, and how do we want to wrap it up? And that's what really hosting is. And everybody's like, I want to be a host. But that to me is the art of hosting. Handling awkward guests in the moment. So if you are comfortable with the content of the guest and you know where the story wants to go, and the guest is matching this overall theme from the show that you are producing, and you're paying attention to the timing of the moment, you can handle awkward moments when they come up with a guest. And we had one, and I knew it was his first time, his first appearance, and we were technologically a few minutes late, and I knew he was nervous and waited. But right in the middle of the interview with my two co-hosts, the guest was like, "I gotta go, I see a fly on my wall." Boom. And cut it right out. And it like took us all a moment to even catch up to what just happened. I was like, I think we just lost a guest. And it was one of my most serious awkward guest moments, actually in the most recent Zoom world that I had experienced. But it was, how we handled it is we collected ourselves and we continued on with the content of the conversation, and we made it more personal to the three of us that were left in the call. And that's just one of many. From television, I can remember I had a husband and a wife on talking about real estate, and it was a live show in New York City, and the wife was a talker during the pre-interview and the husband was quite silent. But when we got to the live television show, she started bobbing, and I was like, I don't know if she feels well. She just kind of started bobbing. So for whatever happened, that was really awkward. But her husband, who had been super silent on the pre-interview, now stepped in and just carried the content while she kind of bobbed back and forth. And I think honestly, it was just nerves. So, awkward guest moments happen, but if you're secure in the content and what your overall communication is for the theme of the show, and you've done your homework as a host and you're not walking in flying with it, you can mostly handle anything. And since at TV Guestpert we book so often our guests on the show, on different shows, we know a seasoned host. We're like, oh, we really like doing the Carol Lieberman show because she's been doing this for 20 years, and even though this guest is new, we know she'll be able to carry it. And so hosting is quite a skill that I think sometimes is underrated and over glamorized, quite frankly. Plan post-production. If you're not doing a live broadcast, then you might have to edit or build that into a release schedule. And if you do a post-production on a show, you can consider hiring a professional editor. And of course, you can do software edits yourself. If you do a live podcast, it is what it is. But when you do a lot of live podcasts, you often get, I see this all the time on the podcast, it's like, hi, are we on? Can you see me? Like the first 5 or 6 minutes are spent with them trying to figure out if the technology and the bandwidth are all working. So, I always say, let's not make these things bigger. Let's just kind of get right into the storytelling of it. Again, technology forgiving, let's keep it content driven. And that's a way to carry some of those awkward moments when they come through. The final version of a post-produced show, of course, is you can edit the content with your overall message and topic in mind. Since we shoot for broadcast television at a 46-minute, we do about four segments, 46-minute television show. And then each one of those segments becomes their individual podcast. And then we micro content the rest of it for social media. And because we have the ability to edit, we will rearrange content to have a smoother flow. We don't manipulate what anybody says, but we'll rearrange the chunks of the content so that if you're watching the whole broadcast, it has a smoother content flow if it wasn't executed that way. And that is an advantage of post-production. But we don't manipulate or change what anybody says, but we'll create it so that for the viewer, it's a smoother watch as opposed to a clunkier, wait, we were talking about this, we went to here kind of moment. That's the advantage of doing post-production. Sometimes you don't have that in the live. So I'm open to any questions you have that you might have at this moment.
Great. So let me rejoin you here. We definitely had some interest in learning a little bit more about that pre-interview. So someone was worried that they actually would be asking too much of a guest to have 2 sessions. And I wonder,
Fair enough. So if you can't get and that's respectful, depending on I think that's a really respectful question, because you're already asking somebody for time, and people don't, they're like, is there a payoff to doing a podcast? I'm not really sure. Are you just mining my network? There's a lot. If you can't get the primary person, you might ask for their assistant and go through the pre-interview with the assistant. I know that in my team, just sometimes maybe based on my availability, my team will have to handle that part for me, and they do it remarkably well. Like, they can handle the storytelling in a pre-interview. So that's one way to hedge or getting around, because it's sensitive, and especially if you're in the getting celebrities or really top line CEOs, you can barely get that pre-interview. So get the assistant to do it. Ask if you can have some time with the assistant to go through the content of the show. And I'll just tell you the transaction in television, if it should, is, I've learned this there, that should translate here. But the transaction in television for content is, we provide the TV show speaking points.
Mm-hmm.
They give us feedback. We agree to the speaking points. That becomes the unspoken content of the show. So it keeps people within a bowling alley lane of what is the expected conversation. When I represent guests on the TV guestpert side, the advantage to that is that I can hold my guests accountable for their side of the conversation, regardless of where the host went. The host could have gone bold, the bold could have skipped a couple lanes. I just need my guests to hold their commitment to the speaking points. So when you get thrown off as a host, or if your guest, because we're talking about unique guests and getting the best out of guests, the guest is off track, you can bring it right back to what was previously agreed upon. And so the pre-interview is one way of just also flushing that out. I'm a big fan of pre-interviews. All the big TV shows, talk shows, always do a pre-interview. So it's a real professional, at that level of echelon, it's a very professionally accepted technique. When we have smaller television shows and they don't do it and they're just flying the guests in, I know where we're at with it. But again, that's why the speaking points in the conversation become really, really important.
And how long do you schedule for that pre-interview?
Like sometimes 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I think the time we ask for is, I think on paper, what we ask for is 15 minutes.
Okay. So that seems like a reasonable
yeah. And then when I'm producing Front and Center, Stephanie and I will do, because Stephanie's our co-host, we'll do a pre-interview together. Sometimes Phil is in production at that time. I'll ask permission to record the pre-interview because I want Phil to listen to it. So I'll just say we're going to do it for a co-host. So I'll ask for that just so that everybody's on the same page, because I want to get through all that peripherally stuff that happens in so many shows that isn't necessary and isn't bringing any value to your listener.
And do you ever ask a guest to help you out in marketing in any way, provide them things so that
Yes. So our team is really, really good about that. So we give, one other thing I don't know if I mentioned, but put a sample of your show in that booking inquiry, or sample of your shows in your booking inquiries. We get podcast interview requests all the time, and that person doesn't even tell us what the name of their show is. It's very, very funny how people can be. So give them the samples of the show. When we book our guests on other shows, we make sure that we have samples of the show to show our guest. This is what the show is. This is the tone of the show. This is the personality of the host. There's so much information to get from a sample of a show. So we make sure we include that in the booking communication that I was speaking of. But in ours, when we do a booking inquiry, we include our past shows, which we love. We ask for them to subscribe right there. Like, here's, please subscribe. We'd love to have you subscribe. And then in the follow-up for the show, we send an email. We'll send pictures, take pictures, screenshots, send pictures. And then we give all the hashtags. And then if we're doing a broadcast podcast where we've had multiple guests, but they weren't in the same podcast, but they're in the same TV show, we give them all of the air dates, because now they're part of a team of a collective show. Let's put that out there. And I would say we have like an 85% participation rate in it. Wow. There's like 15% of we don't hear a buzz about it, but we probably have an 85. If we do all the work, here's the picture, here's the air date, here's the meme, here are the hashtags. We genuinely get it done. And then also I find if they don't post it, then most people will still share from our social media. So if we make it, really big about them, the guest on the show, and this is the topic and their date, they will most likely share from us. We get a lot of sharing participation from the guests. And I think that also has to do with guest treatment, because the way the guest is treated from paper inquiry to post at the end of the show is how they're going to feel about the show and the experience, because you're creating an experience for this guest.
Yeah.
Absolute experience. One of the radio shows that we love booking our clients on is the Jenny McCarthy Show. And pre-COVID, she would book our guests either by phone or in studio. Now, if you're going to do the Jenny McCarthy Show, which one would you rather do? By phone?
In studio, of course.
Of course. Of course. So when we get those opportunities, even if we had LA guests, they were all on their way to New York to do the in-studio booking with Jenny McCarthy. You're going to get the photo. I mean, it's everything.
Yeah.
So that becomes really important. And so what we're creating for our client, our guest, is an experience. And that's what we need to keep in mind here when we're, producing our shows, is we need to create an experience for this guest. That's what that's what we're giving them in the end, is an experience. And what is the residual taste? And you don't want them to be like, I gave up 20 minutes of a busy day and I don't even know what we even talked about. You don't want that. You want them to be, you want clarity of information. You want them participatory in the content that's about to happen on the show. You want them to feel so comfortable in the hosting of the show that they are comfortable giving. You want a giving client. You want to create an environment of hosting that's comfortable, or they're not like, on guard that, you're going to corner them or throw them off. That's part of the process. And then you want to, make them feel like a celebrity, the star, get their book title, get their name right, get the website put out there, and then follow up with the social media. So it's really about because especially if we're using it for the networking, you've got 5 drops in that process to create a relationship with that guest that you want to be far beyond the show that they just participated in. So that's why I'm all about the guest.
That's a lot of good advice. Thank you.
Why it's called TV Guestpert. It's like TV Guest Expert, because I am all about the guest.
I know and I find it really hard to say TV Guestpert, but
it is TV Guestpert. Yeah,
yes.
It's when we're saying it on the telephone for the first time, I kind of rolled my eyes. I was like, but there's a story behind that. I actually had hired a web guy. I really wanted the company to be called TV Guest Expert, but I had hired a web guy who commandeered my company name right before my book Get on TV was going to come out. And I had one moment in the print to change the name of the company before it went to print. And I was like, I needed to let it go. TV Guest Expert. Yeah. I mean, I was like, okay, TV Guest Expert. And that's how that happened. Here I am 20 years later.
Hey, it seems to have worked out well for you. So
yeah. Thank you.
Great. We'll just see if there's any more questions from the audience. You can just put them in the Q&A. And I'll just use this moment to remind everybody that the Podcast Academy Awards, the Emmys, are open, and you can submit your show to actually potentially win an Emmy, which is coming up March 28th. Hard to believe. It seems really far away, and yet soon it will be 2021. I want to thank you so much, Jackie. This was really, I found both interesting and I learned a lot. And I do a lot of these Zoom things, and I've already taken your advice.
Oh yeah, well, you were great with me last week, and I appreciated the opportunity. And what I appreciated is that you allowed me the opportunity to go through the content with you and make sure that I was hitting your audience, especially in our virtual world. Like we're not seeing anybody, so we don't know, we don't have a live event where you're playing off an audience and you can get the vibe of I got nothing but what your feedback is to give
Absolutely.
me as to how I can provide value. I was aware, as I said, with my jumbliness, I called it the Podcast University in my talk earlier today. I heard that. I don't know if you did, but Podcast Academy.
We'll just wipe it out. It's,
And
but
that's what I say to my guests and my hosts, keep going.
exactly. And we've recorded this, so we look forward to many people being able to see this in the future as well. A lot of fantastic advice. I thank you for teaching me as well as making this a fun experience. Thanks everybody for coming, and we appreciate you all. We'll see you next month. We have 2 webinars for the Podcast Academy, one talking about building a podcast community, and then we'll have Hernan Lopez from Wondery joining us to talk about something. We don't know what yet. Thank you so much, Jackie, to you and your team, who are all excellent, and I appreciate being able to learn.
Thank
Have a great day, everybody.
you. Thanks.